I want to tell you about something very exciting that's coming up in all of the hackathons that we have, which we have many every day. The one hackathon I'm looking most forward to is coming up on November 4th. This is San Francisco's first civic innovation and AI hackathon. Essentially, it's an opportunity to go make stuff that could make the city better. And these are things that we did in San Francisco a while ago, kind of in the early days of the open data movement. So I'm excited to bring this stuff back because it can be transformational and it's a great form of civic engagement here. Are we ready to go with slides? Steve? Doesn't matter.
We are almost ready.
Because it'll be a new slide. I did some work. So if we go back in history, in about 2008, both President Obama and then Gavin Newsom opened up the data. What did that mean? The transportation data, the health data, the crime data. And suddenly people went from the thing you would do with City Hall is complain or pay a parking ticket to, oh, we could go build something. And I started an organization called Gray Area, which is an art and technology organization here in San Francisco. And around the same time, Code for America was starting. When we started having these first hackathons, inviting people in to solve problems, there was a huge turnout. It was like, we can find the food deserts. We can build apps that could matchmake between artists and empty buildings. We could build new transportation apps. In many ways, this was the early days that led to the sharing economy of Uber and matching up location data with kind of any other Web 2 capacity. After all of that burst of innovation, Steve, you should let me know when you're ready with the slides.
As soon as you see them up on the screen, which will be momentarily, you can go.
There was a huge burst of innovation then that drew a lot of people into the civic sphere, and Tim O'Reilly coined the term Gov 2.0. So we had Web 2.0, of course, that suddenly meant that you could stitch things together with APIs and build apps very quickly. The government concept was suddenly the whole private sector and those of us who are activists could build things that could include the government. And today's point is we are at such a crossroads again today with the power of AI to unlock a lot of capacity. That's why I call this how activists and hackers can bypass bureaucracies, or as we say, bureaucratic gunk, with open AI and data. And this is the event that's coming up on the 4th and the 5th, and we will have a panel directly following this to talk about that. And let's talk about our experience with government. My experience working early on in government is it was like playing a video game if no matter what you did with the controller, nothing changed. This is a very bad user experience design, and I think that's one of the reasons that people are turned off about government and authority and other stuff in America. During President Obama's administration, he was very big on getting people together to self-organize and go solve problems. I got so wrapped up in this, I wrote a book called The Maker City, and part of that was we get to work on together and make our city. And at the time, a lot of what we were working on was open data. Here's one example. In Fukushima, after the nuclear accident, the government wouldn't or couldn't tell people where the radiation was. And so the MIT Media Lab made a little gizmo that plugged into smartphones that detected radiation, crowdsourced it, and then people knew where it was and could hold the government accountable. Today we take open data. San Francisco is an open data site. It's the raw resource that we use for granted. But back in like 28, in Oakland, they didn't want to release the data. People would screen scrape things, and Oakland would say, you can't have that, that's our data. And people would say, but we're citizens. This was Oakland Crime Spotting, which figured out that the crime of prostitution was committed once a month from north to south on San Pablo Avenue, and so people went to the police and said, you're phoning it in. That's not a crime, that's just lazy policing. But it took a lot of work to open data. So in 2008, people opened the data. San Francisco is very proud. It created its Data SF site. And that's when we started having these hackathons. And the first time at Gray Area we did this, there were 200 people. And I'm like, who are all these people giving up their weekend to go build stuff in the city? And what I realized is it was cool that there was an invitation. And the diversity is great. Everybody talks about the fact that diversity is great. Well, here you had hardware and software people, you had urban activists, like, we want to change something about how policing or the homeless is down, and they joined candidates, because political candidates couldn't get left out, as well as city bureaucrats. If you're a bureaucrat, there's something frustrating, and no one will build a solution to that. You tell a bunch of hackers, could we get it done this weekend? And that puts pressure on the city. And then you have this whole group of people. Here's an example. This is kind of old hat these days. This is where crime was going on down in the Tenderloin where we were. But it was the first time you could see it, and the police came in, and they were so excited we were paying attention, they're like, look, we made that arrest, right? So there was something collegial and infectious about using all this stuff. Here's another one. Okay, back then, the Tenderloin was noisy, but there was no open data about where's the noise. So a bunch of activists got together and put up noise sensors and crowdsourced it. Now, today that's easy. You could do it with an iPhone or Arduino, but back then, the city was a little taken aback. Wait, you fed us data, and now we have to react to it. Such is the power of kind of collaborating on these things. Here's another interesting example. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy comes through to New York. And that afternoon, I happened to be having lunch in San Francisco with the White House Innovation Fellow assigned to the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy usually has slow-moving crises, like we have to transition away from fossil fuel. He was a bit traumatized that day. Nobody could find the open gas stations in New Jersey because the power was down and FEMA didn't know where to send the gas. So I said to him, well, have you asked for AT&T's data? Because if you overlaid the dot on Google Maps where there's a gas station, if people are queuing up, they must be in line for gas, and if no one's there, it's empty. And he's like, you know, we asked AT&T, they wouldn't give it to us because of privacy information. Now, by the way, that was the same data that Edward Snowden later told us that the CIA was using to spy on us, but it was not available for a genuine emergency. That was a big problem that day. So I said, why don't we call up Waze? Because Waze has a different terms of service. So we got a hold of Waze. I kind of sent a note to my friend Diane and said, the White House has a big problem. They can't find the gas stations. The carriers won't cooperate. Can you find the gas stations in New Jersey? This was 3 in the afternoon. By about 6, they had put up on all the Wazes in New Jersey, tell us where the gas stations are, and figure it out. So the White House had their data that night. Okay, so long story short, that was an amazing example of the power of this stuff. In New York basically competed with San Francisco, and they said, we are having a big apps contest. And then San Francisco competed with New York and said, we're launching an app store. That gives you a sense for the energy back then. We realized that open data was an invitation, and that's what we want to kind of duplicate in this upcoming hackathon that'll involve large language models and the city. And you can imagine there are problems like we have city apps that don't work that well, like 311. Or a confusing city charter. A language model can be transformational in understanding that. Transformational in using location data, as you'll hear in a moment, so that we can understand what are people planning for the future of the city? How do we solve a housing densification problem? And by adding kind of our capacity to what the city is already doing, we put pressure on the city and we bring about change. Prototypes can drive policy. In 2011, we did an interesting thing when we conspired with the city. There were 16 candidates running for mayor. So we ran a series of hackathons during the summer that we called Summer of Smart. What we realized is if hackers came up with good ideas, the candidates wanted to steal them. I had a friend who was running for mayor, and she's like, every time I have a good idea, another guy steals it. And I'm like, okay, if you know the TED conference, it's ideas worth sharing. We wanted to come up with ideas worth stealing. And it worked like a charm. And by the way, we have a mayor's race coming up. We can duplicate it. We did one on community development and art. We did one on transportation, one in food and public health. So what would happen is, as we had these, the candidates had to come to the hackathons, and they had to have their favorite idea, and they wanted to be the first to tweet it out. And within a couple of weeks, suddenly innovation became a campaign issue. This is Phil Ting, who I think's in the state senate now. At the time, I think he was either an assessor or a supervisor. He came and said, well, this is policy entrepreneurship. I can come and learn, which basically meant you guys have a bunch of good ideas, and if I steal them first, I'm going to look good. which is a way that all of us can influence the city, and if the city doesn't want to build it, we make it, and then they have to do something like that. Here was an example. Someone showed up and said, you know, there are apps that tell us where the buses are, but if you work on the buses, if you repair them, we repair people who work for Muni. We don't know where they are. Nobody built that. So over the weekend, someone built an app because this bureaucrat said no one's paying attention to us. So they built a prototype app that basically showed where the bus problem was. And it was designed over a weekend, embarrassing the city because they said they'd get to it within 10 years. Okay, so then we showed up at a candidates debate. And Ed Lee said, that's my favorite app, and if I'm elected, I will get that built. A year later, the New York Times reported that San Francisco, the world leader in innovation, wasn't, because they did investigative reporting and realized we never built the thing. And so they basically called Ed Lee out on it. One day later, they found funding, and they built the app within about 2 weeks. So this is how we get to apply pressure on the city. What I realized is, here, look, this is San Francisco. We're a world capital of activism, where the free speech movement, where the summer of love came from. In the 1960s, our solution was to protest the establishment. Today, we write to its API. So, in fact, at the time I was being interviewed, the Occupy movement was going on. I said, well, we call it API. I don't even know what that means, but that's what we're here for. Okay. A couple of other things before I wrap up. It turns out if you take a bunch of young developers and you say, go solve city problems, it's useful to have in the room someone who actually knows city problems. So we started developing briefs that would explain, here's how you might approach housing or jobs or technology or financial empowerment. It's very important when you do these things that you have someone who knows how to solve city problems, because if you're a full stack developer, you wouldn't know that much about solving the housing problem, so you need 2 people in the room on the hackathon. So there's a process there. I'll wrap up with this. Once we started finishing up on apps, we started thinking, how can we actually prototype physical parts of town, make physical parts of town better? So we came up with something called urban prototyping, which basically meant you get to change the physical use of a city. I was inspired by this place in Texas. In Oak Cliff, Texas, residents found there used to be a streetcar, but there wasn't now, because Texas is like car town. So someone said to the city, can't we put a streetcar in? And they're like, you're crazy, we're a car state. So then he created the Oak Cliff Transit Authority. City said, you can't make a transit authority. You're not an authority. He created the authority and said he had an idea for a streetcar, and then he raised $30 million to build the streetcar because it was a good idea. The city caved, and he became an authority. So I got so excited. The work that we're doing in San Francisco, I invented, I just made this up, the San Francisco Urban Prototyping Authority. And here's the point, you're all commissioners, because once we get started doing things, we can accomplish stuff. This was when we started working on hacking street corners. This is over at Autodesk. We had this in 2015, and there's no music here, but you can see the video. We got the city to change the city planning laws. So for 72 hours, we didn't have to worry about Americans with Disability Act or how food or electricity worked. We just got to build stuff. And this stuff that we built was then researched so we could then figure out what was it that people wanted to spend time on, so that when we built a better Market Street, which we're doing now, we had actual data and citizens could do things. So this moved us from the software plane to applying those same fail fast, try stuff quickly, what works, but in the physical part of the city. This was during the Trump election, so you see you could walk through there and pick Trump or Hillary. Okay, so that's a little bit of a background. Over to the present day. How do we apply language models? Very early on, like in 2022, before we all had GPT chat, but when we all had Midjourney, people started imagining, hey, look at this. Here's Marin with all these beautiful high-rises. I can take the BART to Marin in just 16 minutes. Of course, this doesn't exist, but it does get us thinking. This was the other one about the train over BART. But there are some very real and serious uses of language models in cities, and that's what we're about to explore. I think they kind of fall into three huge categories. One is making city services even better, and we're going to hear Anthony talk about that in a moment. One is spatial data, how we use location data, the ability to visualize, do augmented reality, plan, space-based things. And the other is city storytelling. A simple example of that might be, I came up here, there's a traffic jam going off to the left. I realized they're going to the Castro for Halloween. Wouldn't it be interesting to get that data sheet and see who's coming from where to go to the Castro for Halloween? We could also take pictures from social media, run them through a language model and find out who's wearing what costumes in San Francisco. Run that by zip code data and say, what are they in the Castro and what are they dressing up in Pacific Heights and how is that different? Maybe we could run it by demographic data. Okay, that's a silly example of taking social data, city data, and a language model, but there's even more serious things we can do. And that's why we're going to invite our panel up now. Oh, we were with the mayor the other day. That's me and the mayor and Kay. And we said to her, the San Francisco City Charter, which is like a word salad of rules upon rules, isn't that confusing? She goes, you know what? I stick it in GPT-3 every day because it disambiguates it and helps me understand it. So if she's doing that, imagine what we can do. Okay, let's move on to our panel. And thank you very much.